Report from Santa Fe is made possible in part by a grant from New Mexico Tech on the frontier of science and engineering education for bachelor's, master's, and Ph.D. degrees. New Mexico Tech is the college you've been looking for. 1-800-428-TECH. And by a grant from the Healy Foundation, Taos, New Mexico.
Hello, I'm Lorene Mills, and welcome to Report from Santa Fe. Our guest today is Tim deChristopher. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Well, you're an economist, you're also an activist, and you have been in the news lately because of a very creative, nonviolent form of civil disobedience that you participated in. I just want to mention to our viewers that in support of what you've done, Naomi Klein, Jim Hansen, Bill McKibben, and Terry Tempest Williams wrote a magnificent letter in support of you, saying that Tim pulled off one of the most creative protests against our runaway energy policy that they had seen. You've been on Amy Goodman, YouTube. You can find some of your wonderful speeches. Tell us how you drew all this attention to yourself. What did you do?
Well, 2.5 years ago, in December of 2008, I disrupted a BLM oil and gas auction in Utah. It was at the very end of the Bush administration. They were auctioning off some rather pristine lands in Utah. It was a very large oil and gas auction that was kind of rushed through parcels that wouldn't ordinarily be auctioned off right outside of Arches and Canyonlands National Parks in Utah. And there were a lot of irregularities with the auction. And it was just kind of a prime example of our drill now, think later mentality when it comes to energy development. And so I went there to stand in the way of it and ended up being asked if I wanted to be a bidder. And so I said yes and took the opportunity to outbid all the oil companies and disrupt the auction.
So you had taken a final. We were a student at the University of Utah. You had taken a final that morning, and you thought, well, I'll just go see what I can do. You said, well, maybe I'll shout at them when they drag me out or something, and instead they invited you in, and you were bidder number 70, and your paddle said bidder 70, and you have a website called bidder70, the numeral 70.org, where people can find out more about this.
Yep.
And so you were treated with respect, and just like one of the other many bidders. And then what changed in that meeting?
Well, I started just driving up the prices, and then I decided I had to go all in and actually win parcels. And so I started winning every single parcel, and I won 14 in a row before they finally stopped the auction and asked me to step outside and asked me what I was doing there. And I told them very clearly that I was trying to stand in the way of this unjust auction as an act of civil disobedience. And so at that point, they took me into custody and questioned me for a few more hours. And then that kind of led into this 2.5-year legal battle, during which time I was indicted on 2 felonies, and then 2 years later, in March of this year, convicted of those felonies. And I'll go to sentencing later this month.
Yeah, and we have to say that we are taping this before you actually receive your sentence, but the stakes are quite high because they want to. The fine could be as much as $750,000, I think, and the maximum time would be 10 years in prison.
Yeah.
So why did you do this? I mean, you tell me to protest, but what happened? Tell me the story about the Nobel scientist that you spoke with.
I mean, my primary motivation in this was the threat of climate change that I certainly was taking very seriously and very personally. In 2008, I'd been growing more and more aware of the problem and gradually building up a commitment to take stronger action, seeing that nothing the climate movement was doing was actually working or putting us on a path towards a livable future. And so I was building up my own commitment. One of the key turning points in that was early in 2008. I had the opportunity to speak to one of the lead authors of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, and her name was Dr. Terry Root. She was a scientist from Stanford. And I talked to her after her presentation about some of the numbers that she had presented and things that didn't quite line up. And she said, well, there is no scenario that we could come up with in which we avoided all these worst-case consequences. She said there were things we could have done in the 80s and things we could have done in the 90s, but now it's probably too late. And she literally put her hand on my shoulder and said, I'm sorry my generation failed yours. And that was pretty shattering at that time. I mean, I was, very aware of the problem at that time. I'd been educating myself a lot, but it was still pretty shattering to have a Nobel Prize winner tell me that that was the future for me. And the only thing I could say to her was, you just gave a presentation to 400 people, and you didn't say anything like that. Why aren't you telling people this? And she said, well, I'm just afraid that if I actually told people the truth, it would scare people into paralysis.
But they're already in
people would do
paralysis.
Right.
Between denial
Yeah.
and paralysis.
Yeah. And what that did for me was, it did kind of launch me into this period of despair for a while, of going through a dark period where I did feel like I was kind of mourning for my future and mourning for the future of everyone I cared about. But I did come through that and see that, what that means, that it's too late to avoid some kind of collapse, is that we're going to be navigating the most intense period of change the world has ever seen.
Your generation. It falls on your generation.
And it means that we have a greater responsibility to act than ever.
You have said that when people say, well, what can we do? You say it's important to take a stand, not make a statement. Mm-hmm. And what's happening is that there's been task forces, and there have been study groups, and there have been all these brain trusts working on making statements and everything. But you're one of the first people in this country to actually make a very public and very visible stand. And you had said that I'll let you say this, but you had already given up. You knew that the price of civil disobedience is jail is in the future, prison is in the future. No surprise, it's kind of the point of the whole thing. Mm-hmm. But let's talk a little bit about the history of social activism and talk about the suffragettes, talk about the freedom riders. How has change been affected in this country? Who has brought about change?
Well, we have a really powerful social movement history in this country, and the ones that have been successful have understood that, one, it took a large sacrifice. The sacrifices that you see in the labor movement history and in the civil rights movement history are in a completely different scale from anything that's even being talked about in the environmental movement or the climate movement today. When the Freedom Riders got on the bus, they signed their last will. They knew exactly what they were getting into. The main group of Freedom Riders that took it to a new level was the second group that went from the University of Tennessee, because the first group didn't have much support. They just went down to see what would happen, and their bus got blown up, and they got beaten within an inch of their lives. And then the group of students from the University of Tennessee that was already an integrated city, they weren't facing segregation. They said, we can't let it end like that. And they dropped out of school a week before final exams and signed their last wills and rode into certain danger. And we don't have anywhere near that level of commitment in social movements today. We have this kind of one-click activism, and we're told that things are supposed to be easy.
Yeah, you just click on a petition online, and then you've done your part, and that's that. No.
Yep. And the social movements that have been successful have understood that it was their job to create tension in society, to force the country and the leadership to make a choice, one side or another. The women's suffrage movement spent decades educating people, being rather non-confrontational, and they build up some support in the middle, some kind of lukewarm support of people who are like, yeah, I think women should get the right to vote one day, we'll get there. And then they weren't making much tangible progress until around 1914, when a woman named Alice Paul took over the movement, and she said, we need to stop begging for our rights and start demanding our rights. And that's when they started getting really confrontational, having demonstrations on the White House lawn. Women were getting arrested, and it was rather shocking to the country. And
Yes, to see women dragged off.
and
you know.
suddenly there wasn't a middle
To
ground
see their mother and
anymore.
their grandmother
Right.
dragged off. Yeah.
Right. The country was forced into a choice of either supporting women's right to vote right now, or continuing the injustices against women, and there was no middle ground there. And when the country was forced into a choice, they came down on the side of giving them their rights, and they made a rapid amount of progress in a very short amount of time. And I think with the decades of education and outreach and awareness building that's been going on in the environmental and climate movement, I think we're at that point that if we force the country into a choice right now, they will come down on our side. But we have to force them into that position. There has to be that social tension that says that the status quo cannot continue right now.
But there is, I'd like you to talk a little about the climate movement, the climate justice movement, and the environmental movement. But there is a statistic that in the last couple of years, the Americans who admit that they're aware of or concerned about climate change has decreased, while we're having these extraordinary weather phenomena that are just definitely extreme weather that you cannot miss. By the time you have these huge tornadoes, flooding rivers, forest fires from drought. And so what happened?
Well, I mean, those polls are often presented as a discouraging thing, that only half the country actually believes that we're causing climate change, and only around 10 to 15% actually really understand it. And that's presented as like a discouragingly low number. But 15% of Americans that actually understand the climate crisis, that's 45 million people that realize that the way we're living right now is condemning our children to an unlivable future. That's plenty of people. I mean, 45 million people is plenty to overthrow the power of the fossil fuel industry. And one of the things we see in social movement history is that change really never happens because they get the majority of people on their side. It's a minority of people that create change. There was a Newsweek poll that was done in June of 1963, a couple months before Martin Luther King's big march on Washington. And the results of that poll were that more than two-thirds of Americans, about 70%, said that whites and blacks were treated equally in America. They said that problem of racism, it doesn't exist. And that was before the Civil Rights Act, before the Fair Housing Act, before Voting Rights Act, before any of that. Most people said racism doesn't exist in America. And yet the next year, we still got a Civil Rights Act. And it wasn't because the last redneck in Mississippi stopped being a racist. It was because the people who understood there was a problem were willing to really fight and sacrifice to do something about it.
Now, you have studied as an economist.
Mm-hmm.
And so we are, just as there was the racial inequality that Martin Luther King rose against, there is incredible economic inequality now.
Mm-hmm.
And so how does what you're doing address that economic, the rich are getting amazingly richer.
Yeah.
And the middle class is being eaten alive, and the poor's numbers are growing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's been the reality throughout my lifetime. I was born in 1981. And throughout that time, real wages for blue-collar workers have been going down. The gap between the rich and the poor has been growing. And that economic reality is not separate from our energy reality. Our energy policy is a big part of our economy, and it impacts that. The fossil fuel economy is something that naturally leads towards inequality. If we look at the places with the richest fossil fuel resources in this country, it's coal in West Virginia and Kentucky, it's oil in Louisiana and Mississippi. Those are not the places that have really high standards of living for everyone. They're the places with the lowest standard of living in most categories, because that's an economic model that's led to exploitation, because being a limited resource, a non-renewable resource with fossil fuels, whoever controls access to that resource at the beginning gets to set all the terms, whether it's setting the terms with their workers, with the local communities, even with government agencies. And so it's always led to a huge concentration of wealth for the few, and exploitation of the many. Exploiting our environment has always gone hand in hand with exploiting people and local communities, and making the shift to a clean energy economy. Not only is a radical shift in the way that we produce energy, but it's a radical economic shift as well. Because when we look at renewable energy, nobody controls access to the wind, nobody controls access to the sun. And so the wealth is more likely to flow to whoever does the work of harnessing that energy. It's more likely to lead towards a distributed economic system, which is why it's such a threat to the corporations running the country right now, and why the people in power don't really want to see renewable energy.
Well, you know, also a student of history, and you pointed out as in other cultures, for example, 1930s Germany, the more the powers that be were threatened, the more draconian measures were passed. And we've seen, we've had Michael Ratner on the program with his constitutional rights, and we've seen the branding of some of our rights as terrorism or eco-terrorism, even animal terrorism. There are now new laws where students protesting and on public property are suddenly felons. And so what do you think can be done about that, the criminalization of free speech and of...
Well, I think there's a couple factors going on there. I mean, certainly there's the need to recognize that and exercise our civic responsibility to change that. One part of that is those activists that are being criminalized need to be taking their cases to juries, because it's the juries that are supposed to prevent that kind of oppression by the government. That's their role that our founding fathers insisted upon, and our founding fathers called juries the best defense against legislative tyranny, because when they expected that when the government started passing unjust laws like that weren't in line with the values of the community, that people would not follow those laws and take their case before a jury of their peers. And now that system has been corrupted as juries are prevented from getting accurate information and told that they're not supposed to use their conscience, but also because activists often take plea bargains. And we don't have many jury trials anymore, and people don't recognize that they have those rights as jurors. So I think promoting that can go a long way to changing that criminalization. But the other half of it is also that activists also need to tell their story. I mean, I haven't been branded as a terrorist at all in this because I've told my side of the story from the beginning. Generally, those for whom the terrorist label sticks are those who insist on secrecy and those who just do an action and then hide and don't talk about it afterwards.
Now, jury trials, let's just take a moment and talk about your actual case, because the judge did not presented as evidence some very important things, which is that you actually raised the money to pay for those leases, that series that the BLM did at the end of the Bush administration, there were so many irregularities that all of those leases were thrown out, and yet the judge told the jury only to listen to the letter of the law and not to listen to their conscience. And you said a delightful thing in one of your speeches that the white people who heard that this judge had behaved so one-sidedly against you were surprised, but everybody else has been victim of that before. And blacks and Hispanics, and they're not surprised at all that the judge, in effect, presented a cherry-picked case against you.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the impacts of this case is that it has exposed a new community of people to the way that our legal system really works. And it has catalyzed in the community of people that have been watching this a discourse about what our role as citizens should be, how we should get involved in our legal system, what our rights as jurors are. And so it started to spread some of that awareness. And, I think it'll take a lot more activists taking their cases to juries and bringing attention to it for that knowledge to be more widespread so that citizens understand their rights. But I think it's vital that we get there because, I did watch the judge instill in the jury the notion that it's not their job to decide if this is right or wrong. I mean, he very clearly told them that they are not to use their conscience, that it doesn't matter if they think this is right or wrong. Their job is to listen to what the judge says the law is, and they have to enforce it, even if they think it's morally unjust. And there was a point when the judge was talking to each person in his chambers about this, that you could see people accept that. You could see that switch happen in people where they accepted the idea that they had to do what they were told, even if they thought it was morally unjust. And that's a terrifying thing to see in people, especially knowing where we're headed, where we know we have more troubled times in the future. We know that things are going to get harder in our society as we continue down this road of the climate crisis. And we know that those in power are probably going to pass some desperate measures to try to hold on to that power. And history shows that in those desperate times, generally those in power try to find a convenient scapegoat and say, if we take it out on them, we can maintain order and security for the rest of us. And we're already seeing hints of that right now, just with the economic trouble we've had in the last few years. We've been looking for convenient scapegoats, whether it's immigrants or people of other religions or unions. And, it's almost inevitable that in the coming years, one of those categories, maybe several of those categories of people, are going to be scapegoated, and laws are going to be passed against them. And the big question is, what are we as citizens going to do in the name of just enforcing the law against our fellow citizens?
And the other question is, who is going to control the story that goes on from here in this pivotal time? You talk about having put yourself in a position of civil disobedience, that you already had given up voluntarily your power. You knew that probably prison was in your future, this and that. And so you'd already given it up. There was nothing they could do. So you, in a way, by giving up your power, had retained your power. And you speak about your legacy being empowerment, not fear. Mm-hmm. That a person in this situation might feel intimidated and be afraid, but you have kind of turned that around. And you have a new kind of activism that uses art. You point out that Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement, they sang together. That made incredible bonds for them. So talk about the new kind of activism. Then we just have to take a minute, too, to say why you're here.
Yeah. During my trial, an organization that I helped launch called Peaceful Uprising was mobilizing outside of the trial. And they took over the space in front of the courthouse for 4 days. And they sang that whole 4 days, singing old songs from the Civil Rights Movement, singing new songs that people were writing. And they sang together that whole time to show that in the face of this intimidation that was my trial, they were going to respond with joy and resolve. That's something that came from the letter from Bill McKibben and Terry Tepes Williams, is that the best response to intimidation is joy and resolve. And social movements for a long time have used song as a way to have that joy and resolve and bring people together. So that's one of the things that we're trying to promote in the movement today.
And some of your influences, you said at 16 you read Walden, and The Monkey Wrench Gang by Edward Abbey, and a lot of other things like that. You were brought to New Mexico this week before your sentencing by the New Energy Economy. Mm-hmm. Tell me a little about them, and then I want you to tell people who are moved and who are aware of the crises that are coming, give them some advice. Oh, and just one thing that you had said, that it's so important for people to make a stand, not a statement. But you've come here to New Mexico. Tell us why.
Yeah, I was invited here by the New Energy Economy, a group that's working for an energy shift and the economic shift that goes with it here in New Mexico to get rid of coal and also get rid of the corporate imperialism that coal leads to. And so they brought me here to speak to that issue and to the shift that we need to make as a society.
So you are really a great representative for your generation because you're taking very principled stand and very courageous. What would you tell young activists out there, or even like baby boomers who still have that old kernel of activism in there, but have been a little too complacent, what would you say to them?
I'd say that the best activism is something that's a genuine representation of who they are and where they're at. I think one of the most important things about civil disobedience is that it really just sets a stage for us to tell our story, where people are actually trying to understand why we would put ourselves in a vulnerable position, and they really want to hear our human story, and that's really what motivates people, is our stories, and we need to get those stories across in a way that's as genuine as possible. And there's a lot we can learn from other activists and different actions that have been done and trainings and things like that. But we need to get across our genuine story in the way that we're doing it. And I think being in that position of taking that empowered stance comes from acknowledging the real truth of where we're at. Acknowledging that the reality of climate change is definitely a painful thing. To accept that that things are going to fall apart to a large extent, and it does take that period of grieving, I think, to get to that point of acting appropriately and being empowered to take some strong actions.
Well, you yourself have taken some very strong actions, and thank you for coming to New Mexico and for coming to New Mexico Public Television and telling us about it. And how can people find out more? How can people follow your sentencing and what's happening?
At peacefuluprising.org. Peaceful Uprising is the group that's been mobilizing around this the whole time, and they have a lot of updates there about what people can do to get involved during the sentencing and afterwards, and also how to take their own actions.
Mm-hmm. Well, you have taken courageous actions. Thank you for joining us. Our guest today is Tim deChristopher.
Thanks for having me.
And I'm Lorene Mills. I'd like to thank you, our audience, for being with us today on Report from Santa Fe. We'll see you next week.
Past archival programs of Report from Santa Fe are available at the website reportfromsantafe.com. If you have questions or comments, please email info@reportfromsantafe.com. Report from Santa Fe is made possible in part by a grant from New Mexico Tech on the frontier of science and engineering education for bachelor's, master's, and Ph.D. degrees. New Mexico Tech is the college you've been looking for. 1-800-428-TECH. And by a grant from the Healy Foundation, Taos, New Mexico.